Morning. Okay. So I must say I'm quite excited. I've been waiting for this for a long time. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. So this next gentleman speaks volumes, literally. And with over 30 books published as author or editor, he is probably one of the few most prominent historians of our time. Richard Overy is an honorary research professor at the University of Exeter after a career teaching in Cambridge, King's College London, and Exeter. He has written extensively on World War II and the European dictatorships. His most recent publications, The Bombing War, Europe, 1939 to 1945, which won a Cundall Award for Historical Literature, and his newly published book just last month, Blood and Ruins, The Great Patriotic War, 1931 to 1945, in which he argues that the war we all know was actually the Great Imperial War, a violent end to almost a century of global imperial expansion, is something that we need to accomplish. Richard Overy is a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the European Academy for Sciences and Arts. He is currently writing a shorter book exploring the more general question, why war? On a personal account, I must say that I'm a fan of Professor Overy's work for many years. Back in 2001 and 2002, I even met him a couple of times at King's College after reading my favorite title of his, Why the Allies Won, which had a transformative impact on how we perceive the Second World War. His advice back then was instrumental for my future work on strategy and logistics. There are numerous other titles from Professor Overy, which I can name only a handful, such as The Dictators, Russia's War, Interrogations, The Road to War, The Battle, and the line goes on and on. Several have been even translated into Hebrew, and I'm holding here Why the Allies Won and The Dictators. These are the Hebrew versions of Professor Overy's books. While organizing this conference on comparative history of the Holocaust on the Eastern Front and military history of the Second World War in the exact same territorial battlefields, we believe that there was no other fitting keynote to wrap up this important event 80 years after it occurred. Professor Overy, we are most grateful and honored to have you join with us. And please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Yaron. And we do go back a long way, 20 years, my word.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I mean, it's a pleasure to take part in a conference. I hope my next conference will finally be face-to-face.
I hope so too.
Now, what I'm going to talk about today, I think, is how you bring these two things together, the war on the ground, the military war, and the Holocaust. We've heard mostly, I think, today about the Holocaust, and I want to make sure that we do bring these two things together. A week or so ago, I went to the Imperial War Museum in London, where they've just opened their new galleries, the Holocaust Gallery and the Second World War Gallery. And it's reminded me of these two are generally regarded as separate narratives, and the visitors to the War Museum will go down these two galleries as if they are in some sense separate narratives. And I think what I want to do today is to find ways in which we can bring these two things together, the war and the Holocaust, what is a critical period of the conflict. And the critical period of the conflict, which I'm going to be talking about, September through to December 1941, a critical period both for the war and for the genocide. Now, before we do anything else, what I want to do is just remind us briefly of the two histories, where we are when we get to autumn 1941. Operation Typhoon followed on from a period of stalemate and argument among the German High Command in the late summer of 1941 about where Barbarossa was going. Hitler wanted, of course, to conquer economic resources. And so he insisted in the end that the German armies move south to capture the Ukraine, move north to capture Leningrad. And only after that would he allow the main army group in Russia, Army Group Center, to move on to Moscow. But Operation Typhoon finally followed with Directive 35 on the 6th of September 1941. This was the directive ordering Army Group Center to encircle east of Moscow, to destroy the last Soviet armies, so they thought, in the path of Army Group Center. And it would follow on the successful encirclement of Leningrad, which happens in September, and of course the great battle for Kiev and the capture of the Donetsk Basin again in September. Now, Operation Typhoon was launched in early October, formally on October the 2nd, a broad frontal assault towards Moscow by Army Group Center. And there's no doubt that Hitler and the German leadership were enormously overconfident that this might in fact be the key to final victory. And indeed, I have to add that I think many historians have tended to adopt that view as well. So they expected the final push towards Moscow to be successful, and so they have to explain why it wasn't. An extraordinary degree of hubris, though, existed, I think, among Hitler and his circle. He returned to Berlin on October the 2nd, start of Typhoon. On October the 3rd, gave a speech in the Sportpalast, in which he told his audience that the Bolshevik dragon was slain and would never rise again. His chief of operations, Alfred Jodl, on the 8th of October, wrote that Germany has won the war in irreversible fashion, both assuming really that they'd done everything that needed to be done, that Operation Typhoon was going to be a rapid finishing off of the Soviet enemy. It was a wide belief, not just something shared by Hitler and his immediate entourage. I found an interesting story by Hitler's military adjutant, Otto Günscher, who later recalled that he arrived in late September at Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, and he found them very comfortable, very large, very comfortable. It's a nice place, he said, to spend the winter. But one of Hitler's other adjutants replied, "Spend the winter? What are you thinking of? We're fighting a blitzkrieg against Russia. Christmas we will certainly be celebrating on the Obersalzberg as usual." And Günscher remembered a few days later Hitler taking him aside and saying, "Moscow will be attacked and will fall, and then we will have won the war." I have to add that most historians now believe that at that point Hitler had already realized the war would go on into 1942 and that capturing Moscow would not do the job. Nevertheless, rapid progress was made with Operation Typhoon. The cities of Vyazma and Bryansk were surrounded, enormous pockets were made, 760,000 Soviet prisoners of war. Just think of it, 760,000 prisoners of war were captured, to add to the 665,000 who've been captured around Kiev. And they moved on rapidly to what was the last line of defense before Moscow, the so-called mosaic line. Moscow seemed to be in reach. Now, so much for Operation Typhoon. What about the Holocaust? Well, the Holocaust has a less clear-cut shape. I'm attracted to Wendy Lower's description of this, a mosaic of local Holocaust histories unfolding over the course of the summer and autumn of 1941. And what we know, of course, was that there was a constant dialectic, a tension between messages from the center and local initiatives. In fact, we've heard this afternoon about Auftrag's tactic, about people taking initiatives on their own as long as it was likely to meet with Hitler's approval. Local initiatives by the anti-Semitic security and military forces. But from the very start, there was no clear pattern. And there was constant conflict between different sectors, between Himmler's security sector, between Goering's economic empire, between Rosenberg's new ministry for the East, and local Nazis, of course, who wanted to take things more into their own hands. And indeed, a good deal of competition, as we can see, between local Nazi security bosses who wanted to make their area Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, before the others. What we do know, of course, is that Jews were targeted, obviously. They were targeted through Hitler's so-called criminal orders that you would kill all Jewish men in the Communist Party, in state employment, even Jewish men of military age. We know too that Himmler put increasing pressure on his security forces to speed up the process of persecuting the Jews in July and August 1941, even to the extent of approving the killing of women and children. We know too that Hitler finally made the decision to deport Jews from Greater Germany, Bohemia and Moravia on the 18th and 19th of September, so that they would all be pushed to the east. But pushed to the east, it was never quite certain what they would meet when they got there. But what is not in doubt, of course, during this period is what we've heard about all afternoon, that this was a period of grand massacres by the security forces, particularly by the Einsatzgruppen, but also through local pogroms, by the security forces, the order police, and of course the Wehrmacht, which also bore some of the responsibility. And so while the rather uncertain or rather confused picture from Berlin developed across the summer, for people at local level, it seemed much less confusing. Killing Jews was one of the things that they were supposed to do. And we know the well-known extremes, the Kamieniec Podolsk, the 23,000 Hungarian and other Jews who were murdered, the 20,000 murdered in and around Minsk, and of course Babi Yar itself, with its 33,700. And I want to digress a minute here to say what extraordinary figures these are. I think we're used to hearing about massacres and so on, which might involve 100 people or 200 people. Many of the other atrocities committed by German forces in Serbia and Italy and so on, you'd be killing 200 people or 150 people. It's very hard for us to get our heads around the idea of how you set out to kill 23,000 people, or even the 33,700 who died in Babi Yar. These are extraordinary, apocalyptic events, and I think we don't spend enough time talking about the scale and how those involved coped with the sheer scale of what they were doing. Now, what I want to do is to find ways in which these two separate stories can be linked. And the critical period talking about, September to December, is, it seems to me, the point at which the two become inevitably entwined. But how do we explain it? Well, I'd like to separate out three particular elements, and I want to focus on each one in turn. The first is one which I think we don't tend to emphasize enough. It's the construction of a German empire. In fact, really a German colonial empire in Eastern Europe or Eurasia. A trope of empire which runs right back, of course, to the late 19th century, but was taken up by Hitler and those around him as a serious attempt to construct a new territorial empire in an area which became designated an area for colonial exploitation. The Soviet Union, like Poland, was regarded as a barbarian state. And Hitler and others around him used the language of European imperialism in a sense to justify what it was they were doing, a space fit for colonization. And of course it was not. It was a developed state with a large administration, a large military presence, and a developed economy. I'm very struck by the work recently of the French historian Christian Ingard, whose work has concentrated a lot on showing how this imperial fantasy was generated as a central element in German war making in the USSR. The General Plan East, which is the plan we usually refer to, of course, for the ethnic cleansing and remodeling of the Soviet Union, the creation of this territorial empire, was published in July 1941, just after the onset of the military campaign. Creating an empire was one of the things that Hitler wanted to do and had wanted to do for a long time. And this was the place he was going to do it. This, he said, will be India. But this exposed an extraordinary paradox, because the more territory that the Germans took over, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Ukraine, Belarus, the more Jews came under German control. In fact, millions and millions of Jews came under German control. And Hitler, Himmler, and all those around him did not want a German empire, an area of colonization containing Jews. It was simply a contradiction in terms. And it does seem to me that imperial imagination, we want to have an empire, we want colonies in the East, but we certainly don't want them to be filled with Jews. That's the last thing we want. Explains how the war and the genocide come together. In October 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, number 2 to Himmler, organized a meeting in which the agenda was a plan for a total expulsion of Jews from the areas occupied by us. And that really was the expression, it seems to me, of this imperial imagination. You couldn't have a German empire in the East if it was full of Jews. It's interesting that Antonescu in Romania, Marshal Antonescu in Romania, also had the same kind of imagination, and that his ambition in creating a greater Romania was to make sure that Transnistria, that area in southern Ukraine, which was handed over to the Romanians by Hitler, would also be cleansed of Jews. And indeed, a good job was made in cleansing it of very large numbers of Jews in 1941 and 1942. The second factor was to do with the overall ideological perception of the Jew, because the fate of the Jews in the East was not just about ethnic cleansing or colonial remodeling, important though that was. A territorial empire that was really Judenrein, cleansed of Jews. Because for Hitler and the Nazi leadership, as we all well know, and for the rank and file anti-Semites who were educated in this way, the Jew was the world enemy, the Weltfeind. The Jew was the enemy of Germanness, the enemy of the German folk, the fundamental enemy. And the war in the East was a double war. It was the war against the Soviet Union and the war against the Jews who were alleged to dominate it. But it was also a worldwide war against the Jew. The Jew was responsible, in Hitler's view, for all the ills that had overcome Germany since 1918 and the end of the First World War. And I want to quote briefly from a speech that Hitler made to the German parliament in April 1942, which is a speech often, I think, neglected. And it sums up Hitler's view of the Jews' responsibility for what had happened to Germany. The hidden forces, he said, that had already pushed England into the First World War in 1914 were Jews. The force that weakened us and finally compelled surrender was Jewish. Jews fomented revolution in our people and robbed us of any further possibility for resistance. Jews since 1939 have further maneuvered the British Empire into its most dangerous crisis. Jews were the bearer of that Bolshevik infection which once threatened to destroy Europe. They were also at the same time the warmongers in the ranks of the plutocrats. The circle of Jews has even driven America against all that country's own interests into the war, simply and only from the Jewish capitalist point of view. This sums up Hitler's worldview. This sums up why we're talking about the onset of the Holocaust during this period. And indeed, Hitler inverted reality, not just in this speech, but in previous speeches too. Inverted reality, looking as if it was the Soviet Union, the Jews that dominated, that had provoked the war, not that Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. One of a great many moral and political inversions that Hitler made in his treatment of the Jewish question. Hence, to eliminate the Jews was to rid a Germanized European Grossraum, not just the East, but Western and Southern Europe too, not only of an undesired race, but of the real enemy of Germany, fomenting the world coalition against just claims to be Germany's just claims to be an imperial power. A Jewish war, in other words. And in this curious way, Hitler, of course, succeeded in militarizing the Jews in the eyes of a great many German people, permitting them to fight against them in the way that they do. The third factor I want to bring out is the importance of local initiatives. The army and the security forces were prepared, even before the onset of Barbarossa in June 1941, were prepared to see the Jew as a potential terrorist or partisan. Once the war had begun in the East, it was very easy. It was widely believed that Jews were the fire raisers. Jews were responsible for ambushing German forces. That Jews, as Bolshevik functionaries, as communists, as agents, a Jewish intelligentsia, all of these were responsible in some way for what was happening to German forces as they pushed forward. Ambushes, sabotage, the murder and mutilation of German soldiers. It was very easy to explain all this in terms of a Jewish enemy, because that was the context within which the approach to the Soviet war had been set. Of course, they also killed Soviet POWs. They also killed Roma, who were also regarded like the Jews as potential agents, spies, terrorists. And of course, they killed non-Jewish partisans in large numbers. But my point, I think, is that the Jew was such an easy target, particularly as this was the Jewish Pale of Settlement. There were whole villages and towns largely inhabited by Jews. This was an area of Tsarist Russia where the Jews had been allowed to settle and where a great many of them remained by the time the Germans arrived. They were an easy target. They were conspicuous. They were defined as the enemy. We remember the well-known saying by Erich von der Bach-Zalewski, who was in charge of the anti-partisan war in late 1941. Where there are partisans, there are Jews. Where there are Jews, there are partisans. And this justified widespread involvement of the Wehrmacht as well, because the Wehrmacht wanted to stamp out terrorism. And if the security forces said that the terrorists were Jews, well, Jews would suffer too. And Wehrmacht participation was predicated to a very large extent on that assumption. More important, I think, for ordinary soldiers and policemen who had very little idea about the imperial ambition, they had no view really of the larger war. For ordinary soldiers and policemen, they needed an identifiable reason why they were at war. Killing Jews and Bolsheviks helped them to make sense of it. Not only that, but it also created a moral shield against any sense of guilt for atrocity they might have had. Also, there was strong resentment among soldiers against terrorism in the context of massive physical casualties. For the first time, the German army was taking casualties on the scale of the First World War. Army Group Center had lost 277,000 soldiers by the time Operation Typhoon was launched. This resentment at terrorism meant that the Wehrmacht was never either willing or able to restrain what the security forces were doing in the mass murder of Jews. A good example, I think, is the Babi Yar example. A study of Kiev by the German historian Klaus Jochen Arnold has focused very much on the role of the army in occupying Kiev and creating a climate of permission to allow the local Einsatzkommando to murder the Jews. The Battle of Kiev was a particularly tough battle. It was waged by German forces that were exhausted, often hungry troops who complained a lot about their condition. And indeed, the commander of the 6th Army, von Reichenau, sent out a message to the troops that the soldier must put up with privations, as in colonial warfare. Quite an interesting reference, I think, to the imperial paradigm. But like colonial warfare, that meant that any measure was acceptable. By the time Kiev was actually captured on the 19th of September, there were severe food shortages, not just in the town, but severe food shortages for the armed forces as well. Reichenauer insisted that there should be no feeding of the urban population. All food stocks in Kiev were seized. On the 24th of September, the first explosions occurred and the first German deaths. Immediately, the army authorized the hunting of Jews and partisans, in inverted commas. They were helped by the local population, many of whom were very keen to expose the remaining Jews in Kiev. And the army was particularly keen on action. The army commander in Kiev told the Einsatzkommando that what he wanted was a radical solution. And the radical solution, of course, was collecting all the Jews together on the 29th and 30th of September and murdering them all. The fires and explosions in Kiev died down after the 29th of September. And the army attributed this to the fact that the Jews were being rounded up and murdered in Babi Yar, because they had in fact been the fire raisers and terrorists, something for which, of course, there is not a shred of evidence. In this case, I would argue, the military war and the war against the Jews merged entirely together. Now, what followed in November and December were critical weeks for Hitler and his apparatus in the course of the war and the course of the genocide. There were three things: the coming crisis with the United States, which Hitler now expected because he believed the Jews were driving Roosevelt to war with Germany. Secondly, the question, was the Bolshevik dragon actually slain or not? The crisis over Typhoon. And the third thing, what to do with the Jewish problem? Now, some historians have argued that there was a moment of euphoria which explained the onset of a genocide. Some people a moment of despair, but I think both of those are red herrings. The real problem was that Hitler had failed to give any clear guidelines from the center. There was strong pressure by November 1941 from local level, administrators, policemen, security men, strong pressure for a clear set of guidelines about what they should be doing with the Jews. Should they be killing them? Should they be retaining some for labor? Should they be deporting them? And so at the same time as the crisis of Typhoon and the expectation of war with America was a growing crisis about really how do we solve the Jewish problem? I'll deal with each of those three things in turn. Now, we all know that war with the United States changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Hitler came to realize that perhaps Japan was an important player in the game if Japan could tie down the United States, prevent the United States from providing aid, effective aid, to Britain and the Soviet Union. Now, this is something of a new direction, really, I think, in recent literature. There's now much more emphasis on the relationship between Hitler's Germany and Japan during this period. And indeed, Klaus Schmieder, in his recent book on why did Hitler declare war on the United States, makes a great deal of shifts in German policy towards Japan over the course of the summer and autumn of 1941. Hitler had wanted, if possible, Japan to help him against the Soviet Union. It doesn't happen, the Japanese don't want it. They want to move south to get resources, oil, which they need. But Hitler comes to realize that Japan can actually tie down the United States. He's also confident that the United States would not be a decisive factor in a war, even if the war spread out and Germany found itself at war. In another speech, which I think is often neglected, the November the 8th speech that Hitler gives in Munich to the old fighters of the party, commemorating the 1923 putsch, he contrasts the 125 million in America with a German Grossraum of 250 million. He says that Germany has more economic resources, it has more manpower than the United States. Why do we have to worry about the United States? The United States couldn't possibly be rearmed before 1944. What about American soldiers, well, officers, he said, are businessmen in uniform who shivered for their lives. There is no real fighting power in the United States. Now, this is just about the most deluded view one could imagine of United States potential. But in 1941, it didn't seem so deluded. And what Schmieder and others have argued recently is that the decision to declare war on the United States, which he does on December the 11th, 1941, is less irrational than we now think it to be. That the Axis position in December 1941 is more positive than any future historian might have concluded. Hitler is also very confident he will finish off the Soviet Union in 1942. He knows it can't be done in 1941, but he's confident it will finish off in 1942. That's the prelude. You then take over the resources of Ukraine, you then take over the oil, and then you can turn against the Western powers the full resources of Eurasia. Now, the second problem was more complicated. Problems with Operation Typhoon. As has been regularly observed, there was a wide gap between what the High Command thought was going on, Hitler, his headquarters, the Army High Command, what the High Command thought was going on, and the reality on the ground. The High Command exaggerated greatly the gap between German and Soviet military competence. They exaggerated greatly the collapse or potential collapse of Soviet military power. But Typhoon did slow down, first of all because of the mud, of course, which brought progress down to a kilometer or two a day. And then freezing temperatures which followed, which meant, of course, you could go over the hard ground very easily, but then German tanks and vehicles were not adapted to sub-zero temperatures, so that by December, there was only 15% of the Wehrmacht's vehicle stock still left roadworthy. It's an extraordinary figure, 15%. The troops were exhausted. Equipment was running out. By November, the Wehrmacht had lost 2,000 armored vehicles out of the 3,500 it had started Barbarossa with. And it only got back from German production 601 additional tanks. The strategy was itself confused. Were they going to capture Moscow, or were they going to surround Moscow, encircle it as Hitler wanted? The army was much interested in capturing the city, partly because they thought their troops needed a city to capture so they could get the resources and have the rest that they deserved. But what Hitler wanted was to establish good launch-off pads for the war in 1942. And that's why he insisted that the German troops, exhausted as they were, push on, push forward, just in case they could capture Moscow. So on November the 15th, there was a final fling at Moscow. They made some progress, and indeed the most forward unit could even see Moscow in the distance. But in the end, the whole thing ground to a halt through sheer exhaustion and logistical collapse. They were able to make what progress they did, of course, partly because the Red Army was still struggling to adapt to fighting the Germans. The extraordinary degree of ineptitude, tactical incompetence on the part of the Red Army, which was only slowly reversed. But on December the 5th, 6th, Marshal Zhukov, summoned by Stalin from the defense of Leningrad, had managed to create a large army reserve, substantial tanks, substantial aircraft numbers, and undertook the great counter blow against Army Group Center. Hitler really only understood the scale of this crisis by mid-December, December the 12th, 13th. Then he insisted on holding a defensive line, and in late December, the famous Halterbefehl, nobody must retreat, German soldiers must stand and fight to the last. But by then, the German army was close to collapse, and Typhoon had evidently failed. And indeed, one might argue, as a great many historians have done, certainly recently, but even the capture of Moscow, had they captured it, would not have been decisive for the end of the conflict. The Soviet Union would have continued to fight whether Moscow had been captured or not, just as the Tsar's armies continued to fight after Napoleon had taken the capital. The third factor was what to do with the Jews. During the military crisis and the crisis with the United States, the genocide itself slowed down. But Hitler, it seems, now knew that the Jewish question needed an answer. There was clearly no Soviet defeat. The Jewish question could not be postponed until after the end of the war. And in his view, the Jews were now manipulating an anti-Axis coalition, which included the United States. It's interesting, in November, early December, we get more and more clues, I think, to his state of mind. And historians have generally dug out most of those clues. But again, I think it's quite useful to go back to that 8th of November speech, and I'm going to quote from it again, in 8th of November 41, to the Nazi old fighters. To find the final fire raiser behind this war, the international Jew, I would no longer be a National Socialist if I had distanced myself from this realization. I have come to learn this Jew as the world fire raiser. He is indeed the inspirator of the world coalition against the German people and against the German Empire. To Himmler on the 5th of November, a few days before, he had said there would be no 1918. There would now be a final reckoning with the Jews, even during wartime. Now, all of this coincides with the growing local level pressure. Arthur Gleiser in the Warthegau, the annexed area from Poland, was very keen to start murdering Jews because he had nowhere else to put them. And this was going to be a part of Germany, of course, not a Jewish homeland. Hans Frank in the general government, the Polish area, was desperate to set up camps and to find some kind of lethal solution to the huge number of Jews now crammed into his fiefdom. Jews everywhere were murdered or worked to death where they could be, where their labor could be used effectively. And I think during this period, Hitler doesn't clearly grasp that he needs to give the final say. He needs to give something a bit more clear cut. And it's possible that he doesn't quite realize what he's unleashed in the 4 or 5 months before November 1941. Piecing them all together as we do as the history of the Holocaust is easy as historians, but more difficult, I think, even for Hitler at the time. What followed were a critical 2 days, Thursday and Friday, the 11th and 12th of December. By this date, it was clear that Typhoon had failed, and the Soviet counteroffensive was greater and much more successful than Hitler or the army leadership had imagined. But on the 11th of December, Hitler chooses to tell the Reichstag that Germany is at war with the United States. And of course, that he's at war with the United States because it's the fault of the Jews. He makes a promise to Japan that he will help Japan in any way he can. The Japanese do the same. They don't, in fact, help each other much. But there's a moment in which he becomes confident that the Axis can win, particularly Japan and Germany together, conquering Eurasia. December the 12th, the following day, he meets with the Gauleiter and the Reichsleiter, the most prominent leaders of the party. And these meetings were always held in secret, without minutes, people told not to say what had been discussed. He uses these meetings at a number of occasions in the 1930s and early period of, late 1930s, early period of the war, to tell the party faithful something important. Now, in this case, we do know what she says because Goebbels writes it down in his diary. It's well known that Goebbels, the following day, says that Hitler's prophecy of January the 30th, 1939, that if Germany were involved in a global war again, then the Jews would be destroyed rather than the Germans. Well, there's no doubt Hitler did say something very like that on the December the 12th meeting. But what these 2 days do is to bring these three things together into a single set of factors: global war, the war in the East, and the war against the Jews. There's one rather strange aside I want to make at this point. Having gone back over the material that we know about, the Hitler monologues, the Hitler table talk, and so on, the hints and so on that we have, actually what we find Hitler doing during these 2 days is talking a lot about religion, about the Catholic Church, about the Soviet persecution of religion, about Protestantism in the United States and its problems, and so on and so on. And I've searched high and low to find an explanation for why, given all the other things that Hitler is doing at this time, all the other decisions he's making, he should spend time discussing issues of global religion. What we do know, of course, is that there comes no order from the December the 12th meeting, but Hitler doesn't give orders, and I think it would be surprising if he'd made one. But what he does do, I think, is to give a very clear signal to clarify the dictator's intention, a signal that is taken up by everybody else around him. Fighting the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire is a global war begun by Jews. And because of that, he endorses their unlimited destruction. Now, this is the why of the onset of the European-wide genocide. The message is clear to those present. Hans Frank returns to Poland and says, now we can get on with the job of killing the Jews. Himmler in his diary says, yes, all Jews must be killed as partisans and terrorists. Creating a territorial empire, a German Großraum, means cleansing it of Jews. These become the central points of German strategy, indicated clearly by Hitler's behavior and claims on the 11th and 12th of December. They're widely endorsed, and of course we know already widely practiced. Now, these December decisions, if you can call them that, are based on two profound delusions. The first, of course, is the delusion that Germany and Japan could defeat the Allies. It's an ambition full of uncertainty. But in December 1941, Hitler seems to have deluded himself into the belief that the Soviet Union will soon be defeated, the United States will not be an effective military opponent, and anyway, Japan will tie down the United States and possibly compel the United States to make peace. This is a profound delusion, and one wonders why Hitler ever sustained it. And part of the answer clearly is the poor level of intelligence which is fed to Hitler about the potential of the Allied powers. The second delusion, of course, is that all of this, the course of the war, the coming of the global conflict in December 1941, is a result of a Jewish conspiracy. Now, the idea of a Jewish conspiracy goes back a long way, of course, we know in Hitler's thinking. But in December 1941, it's a key delusion that the Jews really are a powerful international lobby capable of pushing whole states into war with Germany. And if there is a Jewish conspiracy to launch global war, then the Jews must be annihilated. They must be annihilated during the war that's going on against the Jewish coalition. And this is a war that Hitler feels himself more certain of winning, perhaps, than the war against the Allies. In this sense, I think we can bring the war and the Holocaust together. These were apocalyptic fantasies, like the fantasy empire in the East that Hitler wanted to construct. But they help to explain, I would argue, how world war and genocide became two sides of the same coin. Thank you very much. You need to put your microphone on now. You haven't got your microphone on.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Professor Overy. What a day, what a grand finale. A lot of food for thought there. And I want to express my deep thanks for such a striking lecture. If anybody has any questions, now's the time. I don't see any questions at the moment.
I think Edward's got his hand up.
Edward's raising his hand. Please, Edward.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Overy, for that erudite and very wide-ranging, comprehensive look. I have two questions for you that relate to your question of timing, because I think it gets to an important point here. General Plan Ost, which you talked about early on, as conceptualized along with the hunger strategy, looks at this idea of tens of millions, maybe as many as 30 million people dying in advance, right? That planning takes in advance of Barbarossa. So I'd be interested to how you integrate that timing and that discussion of mass murder into this idea. And the second point, I think the 11-12 December point is a very good one, but we also know that the Wannsee Conference was supposed to take place in that first week in December and is canceled because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And Wannsee was about the implementation of the final solution. In other words, it wasn't about deciding on it. How are we going to do it? So that predates, right? That predates by a week. Those invitations would have gone out at least a week ahead of time. So I'd be interested how you integrate that time into your timeline as well. But thank you again for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's a huge subject, and I didn't have time to cover it in the range that I would normally do. And indeed, there's quite a lot more on this in Blood and Ruins, my new book. Now, the first question, of course, is very important. Yes, I mean, it's not just Jews, of course, that are going to be targeted, it's Slavs as well. But I think the important thing is that when the security forces and the Wehrmacht arrive in the East, they're already predisposed to see the Jew as the principal enemy. They don't see themselves killing Slavs. They kill Slavs, of course, as partisans and terrorists and Frontier and so on. But they don't see that as what their chief enemy is, what they're going to be there for. Otherwise, of course, they would have killed a lot more of them. And the killing of the 35 million Slavs, the hunger plan and so on, is something which it's not something that the security services or the Wehrmacht are going to carry out. It's going to happen because they're not going to feed people. But even in the case of Kiev, the German army command says, no, you're not right now. You're wrong. You're not going to starve the Kiev. We're going to give them a bit of food each because we want the men there to work for us. And they do. They start to distribute food almost immediately after Reichenau had said stop distributing food. So the hunger plan it's a long-term intention. It's extrapolation from what they think will happen. Whereas the murder of Jews, as we all know, happens from June the 23rd onwards, because for those involved on the ground in the campaign, the Jews are the obvious target. That's the point I was making. I think they are conspicuous, and they're more conspicuous in the old Pale of Settlement than they are anywhere else in Europe. So it's really the tragedy that they confronted. The other question, yes, it would have been on December the 9th. And in fact, the invitation was, I think, a bit before that, I think, November. It was going to be on December the 9th. But it's interesting that what Heydrich says at that meeting is that, subject to approval by the highest authorities, i.e. Hitler and Himmler. So even if it had taken place on December the 9th, Hitler would still be presented with this, really with this lower level pressure, say something. Give us, doesn't matter how general it is, but just give us the go-ahead. And of course, on December the 12th, that's how people interpret it. It is the go-ahead. There are plenty of historians, Peter Longish among them, who argue that actually it's not until March that the key decisions are taken that Hitler really, wants the European-wide genocide. But I think long before that, those who are responsible for the how, not the why, are already in action, of course. The camps are already in action. The murders begin again. And that's why I think that the December the 12th meeting isn't an order, but it is a moment of permission, which is what people have been looking for. And I think that if it had taken place on December the 9th at Wannsee, Heydrich would have waited for December the 12th to see what Hitler says. Have we got permission? And Himmler would have given him the nod.
Thank you.
I mean, there are grounds to disagree with that, but that's how I would integrate it, I think.
Okay, any more? So if there aren't any more questions, so thank you again, Professor Overy, for the...
Well, you must have a question, Yaron. Didn't you have a question?
What's that?
You must have a question, or not?
Well, actually, I do have one question. We know that on the 8th of December, 3 days after the counter-Soviet offensive begins, mass murder area in Chemno begins to work. Does that have to do with any decisions Hitler is taking regarding the ideology in the East?
Sorry, what starts to work? I missed that. Sorry.
The Chemno concentration camp begins to work to operate on the 8th of December, 3 days after the Soviet counterattack. Does that have to do with any decision-making on the high command, German high command?
Well, it's Himmler that gives the nod, but not Hitler. And I mean, that's yet another example, I think, of local initiative running ahead of more concrete permission, and also beginning the construction of Belzec too. So that there's a lot going on at ground level. It's got a dynamic. This is Mommsen's cumulative radicalization, if you like. There's a lot going on at ground level, which at the center, they're getting the messages and they're always having to decide how to react to them. Whereas the original view of the Holocaust is that it's all happening from the center and the people at the periphery do what they're told, but it's almost certainly the other way around. And I think that the fact that Kellner starts activity then is in a sense by chance.
I see. We have another question from Grant.
Sure.
Grant, please.
Hey, I'm just really fascinated about how you're bringing up Antonescu and his designs in Transnistria and this kind of satellite empire project, as Vladimir Solinari just kind of describes it in his new book. I was wondering if you could expound upon like those implications, and I think it kind of reinforces your argument about a lot of this coming from down below, because if there is a country that hasn't planned, doesn't have a decade of Nazi, fascist control, but ends up doing some very similar things based on very similar ideology, it's Romania, and they're targeting of Jews as partisans and as part of this, great, Jewish Bolshevik threat.
Well, I mean, in the case of Romania, of course, there's a great deal of native Romanian anti-Semitism, which goes back a long way. And it's become more and more intrusive in the 1930s, early 1940s. So it's not difficult to explain why Romania uses the opportunity. Again, I think Antonescu, like others, sees this as a moment of opportunity that under the German umbrella, it's going to be possible to do much more with your Jews than you might have been able to do before with the Western states looking over your shoulder. But what he wants is a greater Romania cleansed Jews. Of course, he backpedals later on when he realizes the Allies are going to win. But at first, he wants a greater Romania cleansed of Jews. And that has its own traction, really. I mean, you know, the Germans don't have to push him very hard. In fact, it's quite interesting that when Einsatzgruppe, elements from Einsatzgruppe D watch the Romanian army and gendarmerie at work in Transnistria, they are horrified by the degree of brutality that the Romanians are capable of showing. But that's because there's deep ethnic hatreds in Romania. And you don't have the same deep ethnic hatred in Germany, for example, except, of course, among that minority of extreme anti-Semites. I've just seen a little note coming up from somebody in Chicago that Chelmno has opened, in fact, not to kill Jews, so to kill useless eaters, but it actually just killed Jews as well.
Okay. I'll just add that Grant has an extensive book about the Romanian army on the Eastern Front, so
right.
That was fit about Antonescu. Is there another question here? No, I don't
Does
see.
Miriam have a question?
Miriam?
No, I wanted to ask the same question you asked, Yaron, about Belgium and Helmeno.
Okay. Okay, lovely. Okay. If that's it then, so I will give the concluding remarks and the floor to the initiator of this event and the man that I must say was eager to hold this event, this conference between September and October to commemorate the horrific history of the Babi Yar massacre. And I'm glad he did, because I think it's a fitting ending to this, to commemorate 80 years of this really brutal thing that happened. Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Professor Overy and the presenters. We learned so much. And it's amazing how you always learn new stuff. I mean, history is, I think, the most innovative subject around. You get so much new insights and new materials and new methodological approaches. So this was really an amazing conference, a long one. But I think it was worth every minute, and we didn't get to schmooze over coffee. So still, it was a good, very good conference. I would like to thank my colleagues, Yaron, who is leading the group we established for Holocaust and war research. So Yaron, Daniela, and I'm also with them in this group. It has been for us a very eventful month. We just opened our innovation and entrepreneurship in Holocaust memory course for students from all over the world. And we have students from all over the world, which is again, an amazing offshoot of the COVID. We also decided with our partners in Yale and Connecticut that we are doing a face-to-face conference in March, hopefully. I mean, we are acting practically and we hope to have, we were a bit, we had to take a leap of faith to decide to do a face-to-face conference, but we are going for this. And we'll have a call for papers out soon. The Future of Holocaust Testimonies is 6th conference. That's another field we are working on. I had a meeting with Yaron yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Turned out that we are doubling our teaching of Holocaust and war to the students. For some administrative reason, it turned out that we have a double course instead of one. And we sat together and said, what other new things can we teach? Turned out that even with 2 courses teaching the subject, two complementary courses. We still have a lot to talk about that will not get in, but we feel that this is really an important subject, and this is why we did these two conferences and why you really wanted Professor Overy here. It's not that every Holocaust conference gets to get Professor Overy to speak, so so this cross boundary work, I think, is really important. And thank you, all of you, for being here for all the events. We had a nice turnout. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, the organizers and my colleagues, the whole team in Western Galilee, the chairs. And we'll see you next month in our next event, which will not be on Holocaust and War, but it will be. So thank you very much. Goodbye. Good night. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Overy. Thank you, Professor Westerman.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Nice
Good
day.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Hopefully we can meet after the pandemic is over, face to
Yes,
face.
so we'll put the recordings up in the conference site as soon as possible.